Hello, I'm Jeremy Tritchler. I'm a furniture maker located in Williamsburg, Virginia. I'm here at the Wood and Shop Traditional Woodworking School, preparing to teach a class in September on building this small pipe box here. This is a nice little piece that we're going to be talking about in the future, learning how to do some of the techniques how to make this. So today I'm going to be demonstrating how to hand plane a board in preparation. This particular project we'll be doing a lot of hand planing. We'll also be doing some resawing to make the really thin stock, doing some work to make the drawer inside there. Very nice project to do some basic woodworking skills. But today we're going to be talking more about making a board flat and usable in order to produce a piece like that. So the first thing we're going to do today, when you need to make a board usable, we're going to take this board, we're going to start to flatten it out. Now, the couple of terms I'm going to be using along the way to do that. This is the face of the board, the big flat surface of the board. We've got the edge of the board here, and then the end, or the end grain of the board. It's important to remember all those things in case I use some of those terms along the way. The first thing I want to do is flatten a face. Get that face nice and smooth. That face is going to be used as my reference face to measure off other surfaces as I go. So I want to get that good and flat and even. I want to make sure that I've taken out any of the warp in it, so different warp that we'll see along the way. Sometimes this board could bow, which is where it's wanting to bend in this direction or this direction along the face. Sometimes a board's going to want to cup, where it's doing a shape like that, making that trough across it. And then, of course, you've also got twist that you need to worry about, which is where the board is twisting in a fun way there. So I'll show you all the techniques to help take out all those different types of warp and change in that. So we've got our board. Going to get that good and sturdy in our workbench here. Let me just clamp that down. Want it good and sturdy so it's not going to move anywhere. Now the first plane I'm going to grab to do this is going to be a 4-plane. So a 4-plane is a plane that has had its blade ground with a little bit of a curve on it. In fact, we can take a closer look at that at some point, but it's going to have a curve ground onto the blade, which is going to allow me to really plow away material very quickly to get this surface mostly flat, at least in one plane. Then I'll come back in and I'll smooth out the entire surface on that. One of the things I want to be very mindful of when I'm doing this is going to be grain direction when I'm flattening the whole thing. For the 4-plane, it's not as big of a deal. We'll see that in a second. But what I really want to be looking for, I don't know if we can set that in a nice way there, but what I really want to be looking for is the grain direction on this board. As I'm planing on the board, I want to be sure that I'm going in a direction that's not going to start tearing fibers. If I think about if you're petting a cat, if you pet the fur of the cat in the right direction, it flattens all the fur down. If you go the wrong direction, all that hair stands up in kind of a gnarly way. Same thing happens here. I want to know what direction the fibers are going to lay down flat. So if I look at the end of the board, I can see that the grain fibers are running generally from that corner up to this corner. So I've got a direction that way. I want a plane in that direction on the board to keep everything flat, keep it from tearing out the fibers. So I'll put it on. I know the direction I want to go. Get that on my workbench. Clamp it down. Now when I'm using this 4-plane, I don't need to worry a lot at this point in time going straight across the board. I'm actually going to cut across the grain. It cuts really fast across the grain. You meet a lot less resistance when cutting the board that way. So I'm going to go across it like so. I'm taking off really, really heavy, really thick pieces of wood to do that. And that's going to help me to really bring it down quickly and get that there. Now, before I go too much further, I also want to check and see where I need to be focusing on taking down wood. If this board already has some twist in it, I might want to focus my efforts on certain locations first. So to do that, I'm going to take a straight edge. I'm going to start by putting it down and looking for any light coming through the board. So here I can see when I'm looking down, I'm riding a little high in the middle, a little lower on the ends. There's daylight coming through under here on the ends. So I know that I need to take on a little bit more in the middle. When I come back further, I'm still riding a little bit high in the middle, a little bit of daylight on the ends. If I look at it this way, I can do the same thing, looking for where there is daylight, where it's riding high. I also go across it diagonally. When I look across it diagonally, if I see daylight in the middle, these two corners are high. If I go this direction, if these two corners were high, now I'll see daylight in the corners here if there is any twist. So this part will be higher than those parts, and these two parts will be higher than the middle if it's twisted in any way, or vice versa if it's twisted the other direction. So I'm just taking a quick peek at that. So right now, most of my height is in the middle of the board, so I'm going to be taking some of that down to get it all even. Really quick look just to make sure that we're close to the same plane. Now when you're doing this with the foreplane, one important thing to remember is this is not going to be a perfectly flat surface yet or perfectly smooth surface yet, because the foreplane does have some shape to it. I don't know if the camera can pick up some of the light of that surface that's coming out. You'll be able to see there's some scalloping going on here, these little troughs, because of the way that the blade is ground on the foreplane. So there's some high ridges along here. So that can make it a little bit tricky in determining perfectly flat, but it's getting close. I've got a surface where I've removed the old rougher surface. Now I've got something that's close to in plane. We're going to start planing off these high ridges right now. So the next plane I'm going to use to do that might be called a tri-plane, a bench plane, a jack plane, lots of names for it. You notice it's a little bit smaller. The one I prefer to use is a little bit smaller than my foreplane. It works really nicely for coming back in and flattening those surfaces down, getting it all nice and even. So what I'm going to do now, start to plane in the direction of the grain rather than across it. Start to bring down all those highs that were left from the foreplane. You can hear that rippling sound, hopefully, when cutting. That is just hitting those individual high spots. Eventually, it will be a nice smooth sound going all the way through the board. A little bit more like that, in fact. Still some ripples, but we should have those gone in another pass or so. That is much better. So now that I've taken out pretty much all the marks from that foreplane, got a nice smooth surface here. Now let's check and make sure that I haven't reintroduced any sort of cupping, bowing, twisting into this board. One of the common problems that I've run into with people learning to do this is putting pressure in the wrong places while using this plane. It's very easy when you start the cut to put too much pressure down here, begin to ride with not enough pressure in the middle, and then actually have too much pressure when exiting the cut. And you end up creating a crown on your board. You don't really want that. So a way to watch out for that crown is to teach yourself, you want good pressure at the front of your plane when you enter the cut, have good even pressure from both hands pressing down in the middle of the cut, and then you want lighter pressure on the front and more pressure in the back as you exit the cut. It'll take a little practice to get used to that, but you'll get there. So it'll cut through nicely like that. Just add a little bit of wax to the sole if it seems to be resisting some. That'll help reduce some of the friction, really help you glide through that cut quite nicely. Clean some of those marks up. So now I want to check and make sure I haven't created that crowning. I also want to make sure I'm removing material evenly over the whole surface, that I'm not creating a crown in this direction either, or even possibly a trough in there. So the way I'm going to do that, I'll go back to using my straight edge. I'm going to start by just checking in a few points. Again, I'm looking for daylight coming in underneath my straight edge here. If I can see any light coming in down there, then I know I've got some high points. So right now, I've got a very little high point right down here. And I've got a little bit of a high point there, but pretty even light everywhere else. So a little bit there I can look out for. I might even just make a little mark. So I just kind of know that there and there are the spots where I'm riding a little higher. Come back in the middle, do the same thing. Now I've got a high here and a high here. The other end. Here I've got high right there. So my straight edge is actually rocking back and forth a little bit right over that high point. So I've kind of created something in my board which looks kind of like that, where this is where my highs are. So I need to remove those highs very carefully and very gently to get it down to a nice level surface. The other thing I want to check for, that was just in one direction. I do want to check this way for any crowning. That looks pretty good, pretty good, pretty good. Now it is entirely possible for everything to look even this way and even this way, so no daylight coming through. You might think it's entirely flat that way. You can still have twist if everything looks perfect, measuring the face in these two directions. And that's because if this board is twisted, this will still look flat, even if one side's like that and one side's like this. The way I'm going to check for twist, I can do it in two ways. I can either, again, put this stick going corner to corner and look for any high points. In this case, I can feel it already. It's high in the middle. This is rocking back and forth. And then you put it going the other direction, look at the daylight, and I have a little bit of daylight coming through right here. So that tells me I have a slight twist where these two corners are lower. So the board has done something like that in the planing. Very, very subtle, but it has twisted just a little bit where these two corners are low, these two corners are slightly high. So I'm going to adjust that. Another way I can check for twist is by using what are called winding sticks. Winding sticks are these tools. You have a pair of them. These two sticks are even width and thickness. They're parallel to each other. They're nice and flat, good and reliable. You'll notice that one of those sticks has a lighter colored wood on here. That's going to help me in the process, and I'll show you how these work in just a second. It's very important that these are even size, that they are parallel edges to each other and all around so that you can use these. And what I'm going to do is actually place the one with the contrasting wood at one end. So in this case, I've got my whiter wood at one end, got the darker at this end. Place those on, and then I'm going to sight down them. And as I sight down, I can see if this board has twisted at all. So if it is twisted this way, like I measured earlier, where that corner is lower and this corner is lower, I'm going to be able to see that this white wood will disappear behind this board faster than this one. So I'll look down it and see that yes, this one is disappearing faster, which is what I expected to see. So we'll move those out of the way. I'm just going to make another mark so I remember that this corner is disappearing, meaning that this corner is higher and this corner is higher. It's twisted like that. Come back in. I'm just going to carefully try to take off wood in those spots. So I'm not going to plane all the way across the board now. Just going to plane a little bit in the corner. I'm also going to take a little bit off this corner. Now I'm going to do some passes all the way across to make sure that those cuts all blend together nicely. So I'll go and check it one more time. Looking good down its length. Still all showing up nice and flat down its length. I'm going to check it across this way. That looks pretty good. Good and good. Now it's time to check the twist again. I'm going to do it with the winding sticks. And I can see now, looking down them, that this whitewood, this little piece of holly, is disappearing evenly on both ends when I look down it. So that tells me that the twist has been taken out. The board is now actually in plane and flat and ready to go. I have a good reference surface to go with. All right, so now we have flattened off one face. This face is going to be our reference. We don't want to lose track of that face. So it's good to mark that face so you know where you're going with it. In this case, I'm going to mark it with just a line across there. Everyone's got a different way they like to mark it. Find what works for you and go with that. This is telling me it's exiting that side. This next edge here is the edge I'm going to flatten so that I make it 90 degrees to this face. And then I'll make a mark here to show that that's what I want. So I'm going to look at that edge. I can see again, looking at the grain direction here, that I want to be planing the board in this direction so I don't get that tear out. So I'm going to come over here to my vise, clamp this board in place, and begin to plane that down and get it good and flat. Now, there are a couple things. If you've got a lot of material to remove on that, you can come back to your foreplane to really tear material out quickly. You can also use a plane called a scrub plane, which is a narrower version. It's also got a blade which is ground with a bit of a roundness to it. Allows you to dig in material very quickly and remove material quickly on an edge. This works wonderfully on that. I don't have too much material I need to take off, so I'm going to go ahead and just grab what works for me. In this case, I've grabbed the foreplane to do this. I find that most of the planes I use in my shop are pretty much a foreplane and the tri-plane or the jack plane to do that. So here we go. You can hear it just tearing out that wood nice and quick. That's a really heavy shaving. Doesn't take it long to get rid of all the tool marks. I've got a little tear out here I want to get rid of. That ought to get us really close. So now I've got a surface that's pretty good, pretty close to flat and smooth. I'll come back in just a second to finish that up. But first what I want to do is check and make sure that it's 90 degrees. I need the face and the edge to be 90 degrees to each other. So I'm just going to take a small square, put that up against there. Again, I'm looking for daylight underneath the blade of the square. Put that down. Okay, so here's what I'm seeing. Grab my pencil. At one end of the board, I don't see much daylight underneath there. It's looking pretty good. In the middle, though, I've got a high on the side and daylight on the other side. And then back at this end, the high is actually shifted here. And part of that could be because of the shape of the blade of the foreplane. but it's good to be mindful that I've got some potential highs in here. So now I'm going to go back to my tri-plane to smooth this up, make it truly flat. Looking for a good even shaving along the way. Set that down. All right. So now I'm really going to be able to see that it's high, it's high, and it's barely high on the other side. So what I'm going to do now to do that, so I've got a high that's moving from my perspective from the right side to the left side of the board. So I need to plane across and clear that out. And I'm going to do that by very carefully starting my plane on the high side of that edge. And I'm going to carefully plane a little bit and then move the plane across the board to the other side to plane like so. I'm not trying to tip my plane in order to even this out. If it's slanted, tipping the plane potentially just makes it worse. You don't have a lot to guide how far you need to tip it. I really just want to take that light shaving across the edge to do this. So again, I'm going to check now that I've taken a shaving, make sure I don't make it worse. That's pretty good. Closer. That's pretty nice. So here I know that it's nice all the way across. It's high here. And it's high like that. So now I don't really need to ride off the edge of the board for the next pass. I can come more in the center and ride right down there and clean that all up. Pretty even, and pretty even all the way. I like that. That makes me happy. I'm going to go back to grabbing a straight edge here just to check the whole length. So what I'm seeing is this is actually rocking now. So I've created a high in the middle. This has a little bit of a crown to it going on. So I just need to plane a little bit in the middle and then take a pass to make sure it's all even. And I can continue to do that with my tri-plane. Now, one little trick that sometimes helps, you can remove a little bit more material in the middle and then ride all the way across to try and even that out. We'll see what happens here. So I'm just taking passes for this middle section to get it all flat. I'm going to flatten that down until I don't hear it cutting anymore in the middle there. So what I've done is essentially create slight highs at the front and back. Now my plane can ride on those highs and bring those down to even in the middle here. And you'll hear it enter the cut at one end and then re-enter the cut and exit at the other end. And create a very, very light shaving. And that's actually pretty good over the whole length. Grab a longer straight edge here. Yeah. So now that's even all the way. Just double check that it's still square after removing material. So that looks good. Looks good. Looks good. So that is all nice and flat along its length. It's square to the face. I've got a good square corner. That corner is now my reference corner. I'm going to make another mark here just to make sure that I know where that is so that I don't lose that corner. I don't want to plane near this corner again. If I throw this out of square, I could throw my entire board out of square. Okay, so now that we have flattened off a face, we have squared an edge to that face. Now we're ready to start bringing this board down to its thickness, to the dimension that we need its thickness to be. So what we're going to do for that, I'm going to grab a marking gauge. I'm going to set that gauge fence to whatever thickness I need it to be. And then I'm going to go around and score my line all the way around the edges and the ends of this board, being sure that the fence is always riding on this reference face that I've created here. So that's why this face is so valuable. So we're going to run along there, scoring that line all the way around. And I've got a nice little line that I can watch and see going all the way around this whole thing. And I will be planing down to that line. I've got a good amount of material that I need to remove. So the first plane I'm going to turn to, again, is going to be my foreplane. This is really where the foreplane excels at removing material rapidly. If I were trying to do this all with my triplane, it would take a very long time because it's taking a very light shaving. But the foreplane can take a much heavier shaving and really take this material off very fast. So let me just make sure that I've got the grain direction going just the way I want it to. Get this all set up. All right. And then just start scrubbing down. I'm not going to scrub material down all the way to the line. I do want to leave just a little bit so that I can smooth out that final surface to my line. So I'm going to take away material fairly quickly now. Again, working across the grain helps me with speed, meet much less resistance from the wood. You want to check periodically to be mindful of your line. Make sure that you know where you're removing, so it's a little thicker on one side of the board than the other. So I want a little heavier cut here, remove just a little less material on the other side. All right, and then back to okay, so I'm very close to my line at one corner, not quite there at the other corner, so I do want to be mindful of that. Don't take off too much material there. I'm just going to make a mark for myself so I know, don't plane that just yet. I don't want to lose that in there. Okay, so I like that. I've still got just a little bit to go to get to the actual line. See if there's a good spot to see here. But there is just a little bit of line left, a little bit of wood to remove to get down to the line so I can clean that up nicely, get it down there. So I'm going to start to use my triplane to even out that surface. Get it all good and smooth, work it down. Now what I'm going to be watching for as I do this, the marking gauge when scoring that line has created a little bit of a dimple in the wood. And eventually when I get to the line, I'm going to create a little feather of a shaving, just a little string of wood that's going to peel off of the sides right where that gauge went in. And that's what I'm going to start to look for. In fact, there's a little piece starting to come up in a couple of spots here already. There's a good one. Right down in here. If you listen closely, you can hear that snapping sound. That's just a feather shaving of wood still hanging on where the marking gauge cut. And that's what I'm looking for to tell me that I'm to my line. And I'll be able to see that show up all around the board. And eventually, there'll be the slightest little bevel that'll come once I remove that I'll be able to see around the whole thing. Tells me I've made it to my line, we're in a good spot. Now it's not uncommon at this point to find that because of that foreplane, you've got spots that might reach that bevel a little earlier than other spots. Just be careful with your planing. Right now I've got a little more thickness here, a little less to remove there. So I'm going to take shorter passes to get this down, but I'm starting to get that little flap again. In fact, that little piece just came off, that little shaving of wood to get that there. All right, so that looks pretty good. And you'll be able to see it all around the board where you get that shaving. You can still feel a couple of spots. There we go. From the triplane, or from the foreplane. I'm going to leave this where it's at. If I can come in really close on this, you can kind of see there are just a little bit of splinters of wood, little shavings of wood just peeling up. I've got my marking gauge line and it isn't quite exposed right at this point. I can see some of those fibers coming up, but I'm essentially down to my thickness of my board to do this and get this all even. And I've got that same exposure all the way around all the corners of this face. That tells me that this face should now be parallel to my other face. So now I've got a board that's equal thickness all the way around, just from getting it down to that marking gauge line. So the next step after this will be to make the ends 90 degrees to both the edge and the face. I like to do the ends next, so the order here so far has been plane one face, get it flat, that's your reference. Plane an edge flat and 90 degrees to the first face. Now I'm going to parallel the other face to the first face. So I planed that down, so now this is all one even thickness board. The next step is going to be the ends of the board. I want to square those up, make them 90 degrees to both the reference face and reference edge. The last thing I like to do is then parallel the other edge. And the reason for that is when I'm planing the end grain, I might get a little tear out. When I plane off this edge, I can remove that tear out and avoid any damage to the board that way and get everything looking good and clean. So let's move on to working on the end grain here. All right, so we have now planed a face. We've made the other face parallel. We have an edge that is square to the first face. Now it's time for us to start working on the ends of the board. So I'm going to work on planing the end grain here. Got this clamped up and ready to go. I'm going to want to have a square somewhere close by so I can check it for squareness. I'm going to kind of check before I get started so I know where to put some of my effort. At a quick glance here, I can tell that this end is going to be my high end. I'll mention too that I do have my reference edge facing me so that I can remember where that's at. This other edge will get planed away, so if I do end up with some tear out there, I can remove it and not damage the board, not lose out, not cry too much over it. So I'm going to start planing across this. Now, end grain can be tricky to plane. It's more resistant than everything else on the board that you're going to plane. So having a good sharp blade will help to do that. You can do it with just a regular bench plane. It'll work fine. You can buy a lower angle plane to do that. I don't have one for that, and it works out just fine. One thing that I will mention though, when planing across the end grain, this little bit here, this is prone to tear out at the end of the cut. You're catching those fibers. There's nothing to hold them in place to keep them from wanting to just chip and break away. So one of the tricks that I've learned to help prevent that a little bit, again, this is all waste material here. If I've got a little bit of material that I'm going to remove, then I'm going to sacrifice some of this wood, and I'm actually going to plane just the tiniest little chamfer on here, just a little bit of an angle. I'm just going to come onto one side. I'm just going to carefully take away some of that. Doesn't have to be pretty. No one's going to see this at the end of the day. It's all going to be removed eventually. But I'm just creating this little chamfer, this little angle, this little bevel. And what that's going to do is that's going to help prevent some of the tear out. So now these end fibers, I'm not going to be hitting those and grabbing those and pulling them out quite as much. So that's going to help me out a little bit in this process of flattening this whole board to at least avoid some of the worst of the potential disasters that could happen. So I'm going to come back. Sorry, another note with that. Don't do that if this is already close to size. You might not have material to waste on that. Do it as long as this is oversized and you've got material to plane that away and make it go away. So now let's plane this down, make this surface square to my edge and square to my reference face. So I'm just going to take some cuts across there. Make sure we're good and tight. You'll notice that initially I'm just going to be cutting some wood on this end. I'll slowly make those cuts longer until I get it all the way across, and I will check how we're doing for squareness. So I've cleaned up some of that, gotten some of the saw marks off of that surface. It feels good and smooth. Let's see how it's looking. So I've got some daylight coming through at this end, no daylight at the other end. So I still need to remove some down here pretty heavily too, actually. Now another trick that can help you when cutting end grain is actually, all right, still a little daylight there, is actually to take and skew your blade a little bit. So if I go straight on, my blade is hitting the end grain at 45 degrees, at a 45 degree angle like this. If I skew it like this, I've lowered that angle. It actually makes it cut through the fiber a little bit easier. So I don't want to skew too far because now this just wants to rock and roll and it's hard to keep it on the board. I'm going to skew it just a little. And that's going to help me remove some of the resistance to cutting that end grain. Make it a little easier to clean that up. Oh, that's looking pretty good. I don't see any daylight now coming through, which tells me that this surface is now square to this surface, but I don't know if it's square to these surfaces, to the faces. So I'm just going to check it, looking for that daylight again. That actually worked out very nicely. I don't see daylight coming through that at all along here. So I know now that I'm good and square, and I'll just make another quick note to myself. In this case, I'll sometimes make a box that will look kind of like that on that corner. That tells me that all of these surfaces are square to each other. That corner is a nice square corner. If when I'm doing this end grain, If I've got this square to the edge, but this I'm having trouble squaring it to the face, I'm going to use the same trick that I used on the edge. So if it's high on one edge, if it's high on this side, I'll just move the plane over to that side and plane a little bit, and then gradually move the plane back until it's all flat, or vice versa. So the same planing techniques as you use on the edge that you do on the end grain. But I've got everything square, so I want to leave that alone. Don't touch that again. And I'll do the same thing then at the other end. So I would cut this to length, cut it off, and then proceed to square off and smooth that side too, so that everything's good and even. Okay, so now we have got this board mostly squared up, ready to go. I've got flat reference face, parallel face, flat reference edge, square ends. Now the last step is to get that sixth side there, this other edge, nice and parallel to my reference edge. And the way I'm going to do that, pull out a gauge. Got a slightly larger gauge, a panel gauge here. This panel gauge is going to help me do that longer measurement. But just like with the marking gauge, I'm going to run this around, get myself a couple of lines to work with. Now, if I were removing a lot of material off of here, I probably wouldn't want to plane a ton of material off of this board. I'd probably just saw that off. This is a pretty heavy amount. I could saw that off close to the line. But we'll plane this. I've got some planes that can remove that pretty fast. So we'll put that on there, get it planed down. Just like all the other steps, make sure you know your grain direction. Get that in place. Going to plane that away nice and fast. Again, using my foreplane. All right, got that nice and close to my gauge line. Let's take a quick peek here. So I brought it down. My gauge line is there, very fine dark line that I can see. I've gotten pretty close to that line all the way around. This side's a little bit heavier, but close enough. We can take that down. Got really close to the line there. And now we're going to just like planing everything else, plane down to that line. Keep an eye on keeping it flat. Don't do any crowning. I'll be able to watch those little fibers peel off around the edges, just like I did when planing the face flat. I'm watching closely for those fibers. I know that in some of these cases, I was really close to the line. So when I start to see those fibers come up, I want to be very careful. You can see some of them coming up right there at the end of the board. Kind of curl them up. They're pretty light, tough to see, but they're there. There's a good one. That's peeling up. I really like it when I can just get a nice one to peel out. There we go. So that's what we're looking for. That's the fiber. That means we're getting nice and close to where that gauge line is. Just get that down. 1 or 2 swipes. I want to take those right out. And then come back with your straight edge, again, just to make sure that you kept it all flat. That looks great. You can also come back and check it for square, make sure that everything came out all right. That looks pretty good. A little bit off this one corner. Now remember, if you do have to take a little bit off of a corner, off a small section, if you just remove there, you're going to start to create a crown. So you have to take a little swipe, a little longer swipe, swipe all the way across, and then just double check that it stayed flat, which it did. So now we've got a board which is squared all the way around, squared in every way I need it to, flat, smooth, ready to work with for whatever your project may be, and move on to the next steps from there.
If you're interested in learning traditional woodworking, come take a class at our school in Earlysville, Virginia. You can also visit our website at woodandshop.com, where you'll find a bunch of free woodworking lessons, workshop tours, and our very popular tool buying guides. And make sure you subscribe to our free newsletter to get our latest articles and videos. Enjoy!